Hello, good day, welcome back. I'm Reverend Philip Ong, your co-student in God's Word through Salva Vida Ministries. We are talking about the fulfillment of Jesus Christ's gospel to the Jew first and then to the Gentiles. Now for today, we'd like to talk about to everyone. This gospel of Jesus is to everyone or for everyone. No, but this same phrase introduces another recurring motive of Romans. The availability of God's power for salvation is for all who believe. Now, this phrase occurs 4 other times in the book of Romans. That's, for example, in Romans chapter 10, verse 4. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. In its case, with particular reference to the breaking down of barriers between Jew and Gentile, Paul's ministry to Gentiles derives from his understanding of the gospel itself as eschatological or time of the end of the Old Testament. That is the revelation of the Old Testament promises about the universal reign of God or Yahweh. Now, this required the elimination of those barriers between Jew and then Gentile, laboriously erected by the Old Testament law or Mosaic law, which comprises by the oral law and the written law. See Ephesians 2:15. By abolishing the law of commandments, that's the Old Testament law, the 5 books of Moses, expressed also in ordinances, the oral law. So that's the written law and the oral law, that he might create in himself one new man in place of the two. So making peace. Talking about the 12 tribes of Israel plus the Gentiles. They would like to make one man, new man. So nowhere does this principle receive more emphasis in the book of Romans, as Paul seeks to validate his gospel before a skeptical audience. Yet it is typical also in the book of Romans that Paul does not rest content with a reminder of the universalism of the gospel. It's for everyone, to everyone. But immediately introduces a note of particularism to the Jew first and then to the Greek. It is only a slight exaggeration to say that the key to understanding Romans lies in successfully untangling the 2 connected strands of universalism to all who believe, and particularism to the Jew first. Now, the attempted resolution of these apparent paradoxes were found on the book of Romans chapter 9 to 11. But we must say something here about this particular phrase. In opposition to Jew, the Greek must indicate broadly any non-Jew, but Paul uses Greek because he has no singular of the word Gentiles as part of his own word stack. In Romans 1:14, Paul says, I am under obligation both to Greeks, it's in plural form, with many kind of Gentiles, in other words, and to barbarians, both to the wise and to the foolish. Now, Greek is contrasted with barbarian, indicating that the word denotes a certain kind of Gentile. While then, in Romans 1:14, describes the universality of the gospel from the point of view of the contemporary secular division of humankind. So Romans 1:16 makes the same point from the perspective of salvation history. What is the nature of the Jews' priority first over the Gentiles? So even scholars indeed have sought to remove any sense of priority from the priest. But other students of the Bible suggested that first modify the whole phrase and mix the word as a factually valueless concession to the chosen people of God. But they are without success. So Paul clearly accords some kind of priority to the Jew. Why? Because that suggests that no more is involved than the historical circumstance of the apostolic preaching, which according to Acts began with Jews and moved to the Gentiles. But Paul here must intend more than simple historical fact in light of the theological context here. If we ask the precedents, Paul accords Israel elsewhere in Romans, we find that his emphasis is on the special applicability of the promise of God to the people whom he chose. Let's cross-reference this to Romans chapter 3 verse 2. Much in every way, to begin with, the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. So as we conclude, however much the church may seem to be dominated by Gentiles, Paul insists that the promises of God realized in the gospel are first of all for the Jew. To Israel, the promises were first given, and to the Jews, they still particularly apply in the first century, without in any way subtracting from the equal access that all people now have to the gospel. Then Paul insists that the gospel promised beforehand in the Holy Scriptures has a special relevance to the Jew. Romans 1:2, which says he promised beforehand to his prophets in the Holy Scriptures. So, if God is willing, see you next week as we say in Salva Vida Ministries, bringing hope in times of trouble and witnessing God's saving grace. Goodbye.
Life pull you down and your heart is lost and bound. There's a hand that reaches